She had everything: a billion-dollar company, a corner office on the 42nd floor, a future most people only dreamed about. Then, in less than 4 seconds, a helicopter fell out of the sky and took it all away. Elena Whitmore didn't just lose the ability to walk. She lost her fiancé, her board's confidence, and the only identity she'd ever known. The woman who built an empire from nothing now couldn't cross a room without asking for help. But the moment that truly broke her wasn't the crash. It was the day she realized no one was coming back. If this story already has you feeling something, you're exactly where you need to be. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you stories like this one, raw, real, and impossible to stop listening to. Drop a like if you're staying till the end, and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The accident didn't make the front page until the second day. That was the thing Elena remembered most clearly. Not the sound of the rotor seizing, not the way the horizon tilted wrong, not even the impact itself. What she remembered was waking up in a hospital bed in Seattle 3 days later, reaching for her phone on instinct, and seeing her own face staring back at her from a news alert. Whitmore Technologies CEO Elena Whitmore survives. Helicopter crash. Condition unknown. Condition unknown. She'd run a company with 1,100 employees for 4 years. She'd negotiated 9-figure contracts in rooms full of men twice her age who assumed she didn't belong there. She'd built Whitmore Technologies from a 3-person startup operating out of a converted garage in Portland into one of the fastest-growing enterprise software firms in the country. And now her condition was unknown, and strangers on the internet were arguing about whether she'd ever walk again before she'd even been told herself. Dr. Patricia Osei was the one who told her. A spinal cord specialist, mid-50s, with the kind of calm in her voice that came not from coldness, but from years of practice delivering news that couldn't be softened no matter how carefully it was wrapped. She sat down, which Elena later understood was intentional, a way of not towering over the patient. And she explained what the imaging showed, what it meant, and what the realistic expectations for recovery looked like. Elena listened. She asked 3 questions, all of them practical. She didn't cry. She waited until the doctor left and the nurse finished adjusting the IV line, and the room was finally actually empty. Then she turned her face toward the window and looked at the gray Seattle sky for a very long time. She still didn't cry. That bothered her more than anything else. The first visitor was Marcus. Marcus Hale had been Elena's fiancé for 14 months. He was 34, a corporate attorney, the kind of man who wore his suits like armor and filled a room just by walking into it. They'd met at a charity gala 2 years earlier. He'd brought her a second glass of wine without being asked. She'd laughed at something he said before she could stop herself. And 3 weeks later, they were inseparable in the way that 2 very busy, very ambitious people can be inseparable, which meant they traveled together and attended events together and occupied the same high-rise apartment without ever quite learning each other's silences. He came on the 4th day. He stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in, and Elena noticed the way his eyes went to the chair folded against the wall, a wheelchair the nursing staff had already begun encouraging her to transfer into for short periods before they came to her face. "Hey," he said. "Hey." He sat in the chair beside the bed. He had flowers, tulips, yellow, the kind he always bought from the good florist on Westlake because he knew she found roses performative. He set them on the side table and looked at her hands instead of her face. They talked for 40 minutes, about the crash investigation, about the company, about the statement his office had helped her PR team draft, about therapy timelines and what the board had been told, and whether the quarterly earnings call could be pushed back. He held her hand for maybe 6 of those 40 minutes. When he left, he kissed her forehead. Not her mouth. Her forehead. She knew then. She just didn't say it out loud yet because saying it out loud would make it real, and she was already dealing with enough things that were real. He called 3 days later to tell her he thought they needed space, given everything. He used the word complicated 4 times. He said he wanted her to focus on her recovery without feeling pressure from their relationship. She said she understood. She didn't cry about that either. But that night, alone at 2 a.m, with the hospital humming quietly around her, she pulled the call button off its hook so no one would check on her, and she lay in the dark and felt something collapse inside her chest. Not dramatically, not in a wave, but slowly, like a building losing its foundation one support at a time. She thought, I don't know who I am without any of this. And that, more than the paralysis, more than Marcus, more than any of it, was the thought that terrified her. The rehabilitation unit at Cascadia Medical Center was on the 4th floor, and it had large windows that looked out over a courtyard, with a garden that nobody seemed to use except occasionally in the early morning. Elena had been there for 3 weeks when the dynamics of her professional life began showing their fractures in ways she could no longer ignore. The board calls started cordial, concerned even. Fletcher Graves, the chairman, assured her twice in the first week that the company was in good hands and that she should focus on herself. What that actually meant became clear around the second week, when she noticed that certain decisions were being routed around her, that meeting invites were being dropped from her calendar without explanation, that the replies to her emails, when they came, were getting shorter. Her COO, Dennis Park, was the only one who came to see her in person. He sat across from her in the rehab lounge and laid it out plainly, because he'd known her long enough to understand she didn't want to be managed. They're scared, he said. Fletcher and the others. They don't know how to categorize you right now. I'm the same person, Elena said. Dennis looked at her steadily. I know that. So tell them that. I have. He paused. Elena, I'm telling you what I'm seeing, not what I think is right. Half the board is already floating names. For my position. For an interim position. In case. He cleared his throat. There are investors asking questions about continuity of leadership. She held his gaze. What kind of questions? The kind that assume you won't come back. The room was quiet for a moment. Elena's hands rested on the wheels of her chair, and she became suddenly, sharply aware of how that looked. How she must appear to the people who'd known her only as the woman who moved fast, who leaned over conference tables, who walked into rooms first and walked out last. I'm coming back, she said. Dennis nodded. He didn't argue, but he also didn't look entirely convinced, and that was its own kind of answer. The worst part, she decided, was not the pain. Physical therapy was painful, achingly, sometimes humiliatingly so. But pain was concrete. She could work with pain. She could name it. The worst part was the way people talked to her now. Slowly. Loudly. With exaggerated patience, as though the injury to her spinal cord had somehow traveled up into her brain. Nurses sometimes answered questions she hadn't asked, anticipating needs she hadn't expressed. A hospital administrator had explained the discharge process to her in the tone one might use with a confused elderly patient, and Elena had nodded along without correcting him because she was too tired that day to be the person who corrected people. Visitors came, initially. Colleagues, a few friends, 2 women from her building who brought expensive coffee and good intentions and clearly had no idea what to say, so they said a lot of nothing in careful, pleasant voices. The visits thinned after the second week. By the third week, most of them had stopped altogether. She was alone more often than not, which she had never minded before. She'd always been comfortable in her own company. But solitude built for productivity is different from solitude that has nowhere to go, and Elena found herself sitting in the rehabilitation garden on a Tuesday afternoon with a legal pad full of notes she had no energy to act on, watching a sparrow investigate a crack in the courtyard pavement, and feeling something she hadn't felt since she was 22 years old and broke and uncertain about everything. She felt small. Ryan Carter came to Cascadia Medical on a Thursday. He wasn't assigned to her floor. He was an emergency medical technician based out of Station 14 in the East Side District, and he was there on a patient transfer, accompanying a 47-year-old man named Gerald, who had suffered a cardiac event in the parking lot of a grocery store and needed monitoring during transport to a specialist 2 buildings over. But the elevator was occupied by a surgical team moving equipment, so Ryan was told to wait on the 4th floor. He parked Gerald's gurney in the corridor and stood by the elevator bank with his radio on low, scrolling through a text from his daughter's school about a field trip permission slip he kept forgetting to sign. He was still looking at his phone when he heard the wheel of a chair catch on the lip of the garden doorway. A small, sharp scrape, followed by a muffled word that was clearly a curse, even though he couldn't quite make it out. He looked up. A woman in a wheelchair was trying to navigate back inside from the garden, and the right wheel had caught in the small gap where the door track met the floor. She was leaning forward, trying to work it free herself, jaw set, not looking up. Ryan walked over. He didn't ask permission. There wasn't time for a whole conversation about it. He just crouched down, assessed where the wheel was caught, and lifted the frame slightly at the right angle. The wheel came free. There, he said, and stood up. She looked at him. Mid-30s, maybe. Sharp eyes, dark circles under them that no amount of expensive face care was masking. Dark hair pulled back into a practical knot. She was wearing a gray long-sleeve shirt and had a legal pad on her lap, covered in what looked like financial notations. She did not look like a woman who needed or wanted anyone's help, and the way she looked at him made that very clear. I had it, she said. You almost did, Ryan said. That surprised her. Most people would have apologized for implying she needed assistance. He just said the honest thing and kept his expression neutral about it. Thank you, she said, after a moment. Like it cost her something. Sure. He checked his radio, looked back down the corridor. The elevator was still occupied. She didn't go back inside. She sat in the doorway, half in and half out, legal pad on her lap, looking at him in a way that suggested she was deciding whether he was worth talking to or not. You're not a nurse, she said. EMT. I'm waiting on an elevator. How long have you been waiting? About 8 minutes. It's always at least 15 when the surgical team has it. She said it flatly from experience. There's a coffee cart down the hall. The coffee is terrible, but it's hot. He almost smiled. I'm good. Thanks. A pause. Her pen tapped once against the legal pad. Do you do this every day? She asked. Transport people? When I'm not running calls, yeah. You like it? He thought about it. Actually thought about it, which she noticed. Some days, he said. Today's okay so far. She looked down at her legal pad. What would a bad day look like? Ones where the call doesn't go the way it should. He said it simply, without drama. Ones where you drive back to the station and the cab is quiet. She was quiet for a moment. I had a bad 4 weeks, she said. I can see that. She looked up sharply, maybe expecting something softer or more apologetic. He just looked back at her. Not with pity, not with the particular careful gentleness people had been throwing at her like a net. He just looked at her, the way you look at someone you've just met and are trying to read, which is to say, at her face, not at her chair. What's your name? She asked. Ryan Carter. Elena Whitmore. He nodded. He didn't react to the name, which told her either he didn't follow business news or he was too practiced to show it. Can I ask you something? She said. He spread his hand slightly. Go ahead. If someone... She stopped. Started again differently. If a person loses the thing that defined them, not just a job, the whole picture of what their life was supposed to be. She wasn't looking at him now, looking somewhere past his shoulder. Do you think they can actually recover, not function again, recover? Ryan put his radio in his vest pocket. The elevator down the hall had just opened, but he wasn't moving yet. He thought about a hospital room 3 years ago, and a doctor saying words he hadn't been prepared to hear, and driving home after to a house with a 6-year-old asleep in the back bedroom who was going to wake up in the morning and still need breakfast and clean clothes, and someone to walk her to the bus stop. He thought about how the grief had not gone away. It had just changed shape, made room for other things alongside it. I don't think recovery means going back, he said. I think it means figuring out what comes after, which is harder and slower, and nobody tells you that part. He paused. But yeah, I think it's possible. Elena looked at him. That's not a comforting answer, she said. No, he agreed. But you didn't ask me for comfort. The elevator opened. His radio crackled with Gerald's attending nurse asking for an ETA. I have to go, Ryan said. She nodded. Already pulling back into herself, pen moving toward the legal pad, angle of her shoulders shifting to something more closed. He walked toward the elevator, then stopped and looked back once. She was writing something down, fast, purposeful, like the conversation had shaken something loose and she needed to catch it before it settled again. He got in the elevator and let the doors close. That night, in the hospital room with the lights low and the legal pad on her lap and the yellow tulips Marcus had brought now overripe in their vase, Elena Whitmore wrote 7 lines at the top of a blank page. Not a business strategy, not a board memo, just 7 lines about what she wanted, not what the company needed, not what recovery was supposed to look like according to the literature her doctors had given her. What she personally wanted from tomorrow, from the next year, from whatever this new version of her life was going to be. She stared at it for a long time. Then she picked up the pen and wrote an 8th line. Figure out who you are when none of the rest of it is there. She didn't know yet that the man who'd said the things she needed to hear was raising a daughter alone on an EMT's salary and running on 4 hours of sleep most nights. She didn't know about Sophie or about the wife Ryan had lost or about any of the weight he carried with such quiet consistency that most people never noticed it was there. She just knew that for the first time in 4 weeks, someone had looked at her, actually looked at her, and spoken to her like she was still the person she'd always been. She wasn't sure yet what to do with that, but she held on to it. In the dark, in the quiet, in the room that smelled like antiseptic and old flowers, she held on to it like the thing it was. A small, stubborn sign that something in her had not yet given up. She didn't expect to see him again. That was the honest truth of it. Ryan Carter had been an elevator delay and an accidental conversation, a stranger who said something she needed to hear and then walked back into his own life, which had nothing to do with hers. Elena had spent the days after their brief exchange trying to decide if the conversation had actually meant anything, or if she'd simply been starved enough for genuine human contact that even a 10-minute exchange with an EMT waiting on an elevator had felt significant. She concluded, after some internal argument, that it had been both things at once, meaningful and also a measure of how depleted she was. Both could be true. She had other things to focus on anyway. The board had scheduled a formal call for the following Tuesday, framed as a wellness check, which was the kind of language that meant the opposite of what it said. Dennis had sent her a heads up the night before, a single text that read, "Fletcher's going to ask about a timeline. Be specific or they'll fill in the blank themselves." She'd read it 3 times, appreciated his bluntness, and spent Sunday going through 14 months of company financials to remind herself of every number she'd ever owned. The call lasted 90 minutes. Fletcher Graves led it in the careful, measured tone of a man who had rehearsed. 3 other board members joined. They asked about her health, politely, briefly, as though it were a box to check before moving on. Then Fletcher asked about her timeline for returning to active leadership, and Elena told him she expected to be back in a functional capacity within 60 days and fully operational within 90. There was a pause on the line. "That's ambitious," Fletcher said. "It's accurate," Elena said. "Elena." His voice shifted into something paternal that made her jaw tighten. "No one would fault you for taking more time, given the circumstances." "What circumstances are you referring to specifically, Fletcher?" Another pause. "The nature of your injury." "My injury affects my legs," she said. "Not my judgment, not my memory, not my understanding of this company's architecture, its client relationships, or its growth strategy. I built the Q3 roadmap from this bed. Dennis can confirm that." Dennis, who was on the line but largely silent, said, "Confirmed." Fletcher moved on. The call ended without a clean resolution. No one said she was out, no one said she was fully in, and the ambiguity sat in her chest like a stone for the rest of the afternoon. She knew what that kind of ambiguity meant in boardrooms. It meant the conversation was happening in other places, without her. She thought about calling Marcus, not because she wanted him back. That door had closed fast enough that she'd barely heard it shut, but because he'd been fluent in the unspoken rules of board politics, and she was running low on allies who understood those rules from the inside. She didn't call him. She put the phone face down on the bedside table and stared at the ceiling for a while instead. The rehabilitation garden was the one place in the building that didn't feel like a hospital. That was the only reason she kept going back. It was small, a square of outdoor space with 3 raised beds of low-maintenance perennials, a concrete path just wide enough for a wheelchair, and 2 benches that nobody used because the people who needed the garden couldn't always get there on their own, and the people who could get there easily didn't think to bother. Elena had started going at 7:30 in the morning, before the floor got busy, when the light was gray and flat and the sparrows were working the planters for insects, and she could sit there without anyone asking her how she was feeling. She was there on a Friday morning, 10 days after she'd last seen Ryan, when she heard voices in the main corridor. A woman's voice, clipped and professional, and a man's voice that she recognized before she consciously placed it. She didn't move. She wasn't sure why. She just stayed where she was, legal pad on her lap, pen still, listening to the sound of his voice through the glass door without being able to make out the words. Then the voices moved away down the hall, and she looked back at her legal pad and realized she'd drawn a horizontal line across the middle of the page without noticing. She pressed too hard. The pen had torn slightly through the paper. She flipped to a clean page and went back to work. It was Sophie who brought them back into the same orbit, and Sophie did it the way 6-year-olds do most things, suddenly, completely, and with no concern for anyone's composure. The allergic reaction happened on a Saturday. Ryan had been at the park with her, the one 3 blocks from their apartment with the climbing structure shaped like a ship, which Sophie had been obsessed with for the better part of a year. She'd had a granola bar from another kid's lunch, traded for something, Ryan still wasn't entirely clear on what. And by the time they were walking back to the car, she was scratching at her neck, and her eyes were swollen, and Ryan had already seen enough allergic responses in his work life to know what the next 20 minutes were going to look like. He'd used the EpiPen from the kit he kept in the diaper bag, holdover habit from when Sophie was smaller, and one he was now very glad he hadn't broken, while calling 911 with his other hand. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was already on the ground with her, keeping her calm, talking to her about the ship climbing structure and which part of it was her favorite, because the most important thing was keeping her breathing steady and her panic low. And he knew that, and he knew how to do that. And he still had to keep reminding himself to breathe properly too, because this was his daughter, and the professional distance that made him good at his job was not something he could fully find right now. She was stable by the time they reached Cascadia Medical. The attending physician on duty was efficient and clear, a doctor named Huang, who spoke directly to Ryan because Ryan was asking direct questions, and who told him Sophie's reaction had been significant, but that she'd responded well to treatment and would need to be monitored for a few hours before discharge. Ryan sat in the plastic chair next to Sophie's bed while she slept off the antihistamines, her small chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm that he kept watching because he needed to keep watching it. He had called his mother from the ambulance. She was Sophie's usual backup and lived 40 minutes away, and she was on her way but hadn't arrived yet. His shift supervisor had been notified. The paperwork would sort itself out. He sat there in the chair, elbows on his knees, and let the adrenaline finish moving through him. After a while, when Sophie's color was better and her breathing was even and he was reasonably certain the worst of it had passed, he got up and walked down the hall to find coffee. The machine near the nurse's station was out of order. The cart near the elevator bank was unmanned. He ended up walking a longer route than he'd intended, taking a turn he recognized from his patient transfer 10 days earlier, and found himself near the rehabilitation unit without exactly having planned to be there. The garden door was closed, but the lights were on inside, and through the glass he could see Elena Whitmore sitting in the same position she'd been in the last time, chair parallel to the raised bed, legal pad on her lap, pen in hand. She was not writing. She was looking at something in the planter box, some small thing he couldn't identify from the corridor, with an expression on her face that she probably wouldn't have wanted anyone to see. He pushed the door open. She looked up. Something moved across her face, surprise, and then something more guarded that replaced it quickly. "Your elevator's not stuck again," she said. "My daughter's up the hall," he said. "Allergic reaction. She's okay," he added, because the way Elena's expression shifted told him she'd read the severity in his voice before he'd thought to soften it. "How old?" "6. Elena looked at him for a moment. "Sit down," she said, and nodded at the concrete bench along the garden wall. "You look like you need to be somewhere that isn't a corridor." He sat. It was cold on the bench, early morning, late in the year, but the air was good, and he needed air. Neither of them said anything for a while. A sparrow landed on the rim of the nearest planter box and immediately lost interest and left. "Her name's Sophie," Ryan said eventually. Not sure why he said it. Maybe just to say it out loud to someone. "Is it just the two of you?" He nodded. Elena absorbed that. "How long?" 3 years. He looked at the planter. Her mother had a brain aneurysm. No warning, she was 31. He said it the way people say things they've said many times. Not without feeling, but with the feeling compressed into something manageable. Elena didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say anything for a beat, which he appreciated, because the reflexive "I'm so sorry" always made him feel obligated to reassure the other person. 3 years, she said finally, quietly.
And you've been doing it alone the whole time. My mother helps, friends here and there.
He exhaled. Mostly, yeah. That's... She stopped. That's a lot to carry. It's what there is, he said simply. Not self-pity, not false stoicism, just the fact of it. Elena looked down at her legal pad. The page was mostly blank. She'd been staring at it for the better part of an hour without writing anything useful, which was itself a symptom of something she hadn't fully wanted to name. I had a board call this week, she said. She wasn't sure why she said it either, but it felt like an even exchange. They used the word ambitious to describe my timeline for returning to work, like I was being naive. She tapped the pen against the pad once. I've been running this company since I was 26 years old. I built it, and now they're using the word ambitious to describe me wanting to go back to my own job. Ryan turned to look at her. What did you say? I told them my injury affects my legs, not my judgment. The corner of his mouth moved. Good. They didn't look convinced. Did it matter what they looked like? She opened her mouth, closed it. It shouldn't. But I've spent my whole career learning to read rooms. And that room felt like people who had already made a decision and were giving me the courtesy of participating in the conversation. She said it without bitterness, almost clinically, the way you talk about something when you've processed enough of it to look at it straight. I've been trying to figure out if I'm wrong about that or if I'm right about it and just don't want to be. Ryan was quiet. He looked at the garden, the small square of it, the dormant plants, the sparrow that had come back and was now methodically checking the same 3 spots along the planter's rim. In my job, he said, you learn pretty fast that your read of a room is usually accurate. The instinct people have when they walk into a scene, before they've consciously processed everything, that instinct is almost always right. The mistake is talking yourself out of it, because the truth is inconvenient. Elena looked at him. So you think they've already decided? I think you already think they've already decided. He met her eyes. Which is different, and probably worth separating out. She stared at him. Then something in her expression shifted, not softening, exactly, but like a piece of tension that had been held too long finally let out a breath. I don't know why I keep telling you things, she said. Because I'm not on your board and I don't work for you, Ryan said. And I don't look at you like you're fragile. She looked away. Outside, beyond the garden, the sky was lightening by degrees from gray to pale white. No, she said quietly. You don't. Ryan went back to Sophie's room an hour before his mother arrived. His daughter was awake by then, groggy from the medication, her small face puffy and her eyes still pink at the edges. She looked up at him when he came in and said, Dad, the nurse has purple shoes, with such earnest priority that he laughed for the first time all day. Yeah? He said, sitting down next to her. Are they good purple or weird purple? Good purple, Sophie said seriously, the kind with the little sparkles. High praise. She leaned against his arm and he let her, resting his chin on top of her head. She smelled like the hospital's soap, and underneath it, faintly, like the specific combination of things that was just her, the cherry-scented lip balm she'd discovered 3 months ago and applied to everything including, once, the cat at his mother's house, and something vaguely like grass and sunshine that seemed to cling to her regardless of the season. I was not a man who cried easily. He hadn't cried the day of his wife's funeral, had stood at the front of the room holding Sophie, who was too young to understand any of it, and kept his face steady because he could fall apart later in private, and he needed Sophie to see him standing. He'd cried exactly twice since then, both times at night, both times quietly, in a way he'd been vaguely ashamed of afterward for no rational reason. He didn't cry now either, but he kept his chin on Sophie's head and his arm around her small shoulders, and he stayed very still for a long time, just feeling her breathe. Dad, Sophie said eventually. Yeah. The lady in the garden has a cool chair. He went still. What? I saw her when the nurse was walking me to the bathroom, through the glass. Sophie adjusted herself against his arm, losing interest in the topic as fast as she'd raised it. Can I have Jell-O? The nurse said maybe. He blinked. Sure, I'll ask. He went to find the nurse with the purple shoes, but as he walked down the hall, he was already thinking about Sophie having seen Elena through the garden door. Sophie, who noticed things like purple shoes and cool chairs, who had inherited from her mother an ability to simply observe the world without the layer of judgment that adults accumulated over time. He didn't think much more about it right then. There were discharge forms to fill out, and his mother arrived 20 minutes later in a state of barely contained alarm that he spent another 20 minutes talking down, and Sophie wanted apple juice, and then fell asleep wanting apple juice, and by the time they left the hospital, the afternoon was nearly gone. He didn't think more about it until much later, at home, when Sophie was finally down and the apartment was quiet, and he was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold. He thought about Elena in the garden with her legal pad and her corporate instincts and the things she'd said about not knowing why she kept telling him things. He understood that, actually. The people you told things to without planning to weren't usually the people you knew best. They were the people who happened to be there when the thing needed to be said, and who didn't flinch when they heard it. He drank the cold tea. He thought about what she'd said about the board, and about ambition being used as a word that meant something else, and about building a company from nothing, and then having the people she'd built it for look at her like she was a liability. I thought about what it was like to lose your whole map of the future in a moment. He and Sophie went back to their lives, and Elena went back to hers, and another 2 weeks went by. She was in physical therapy when the thing with the board became undeniable. The session was going badly. It went badly more often than not, which her therapist, a woman named Carla, who had the patience of someone who had been told hard truths by enough patience that she no longer took resistance personally, attributed to Elena's tendency to push past the point of diminishing returns and then crash. Elena's own theory was that her body was doing what it wanted, and her input was largely ceremonial, but she kept that to herself. She was in the middle of a transfer exercise, moving from the mat to the chair under Carla's guidance, which sounds simple and is not, when her phone buzzed on the bench with a notification from a financial news app she'd had since her first year running the company. She wasn't looking at her phone. She was concentrating on the transfer. But when she finally got settled and Carla stepped back to make notes, Elena picked up the phone on reflex. The headline read, "Whitmore Technologies names Dennis Park interim CEO amid leadership uncertainty." She read it twice. Then she put the phone face down on her lap and sat very still. "Everything okay?" Carla asked. "Fine," Elena said. Her voice was even. She was proud of that, briefly, and then the pride curdled into something else. "You want to take 5? "No, keep going." Carla looked at her for a long moment, the look of someone who has learned that pushing patience in moments like this sometimes yields the most important breakthroughs and sometimes just produces injuries. "Okay," she said carefully, and they kept going. Elena did not cry in the session. She did not cry afterward, in the hallway, or in the elevator, or in her room where she sat with the phone on the bed and read the article in full 3 times, parsing every sentence for what it said and what it implied. Dennis, honest Dennis, had texted her before the article went live, a message she'd missed while in therapy. It said, "They moved faster than I expected. I tried to slow it down. I'm sorry. This isn't over unless you decide it is." She read that part again. "This isn't over unless you decide it is." She put the phone down. The room was very quiet. The tulips were long gone, replaced at some point by a small succulent one of her employees had sent in a pot with the note she'd appreciated. The legal pad on her side table had 40-some pages of notes on it, strategy documents, financial analyses, talking points, all of which now felt like they'd been written by a person who had misunderstood the situation she was actually in. She thought about the accident, about the 4 seconds of understanding before impact, during which her brain had apparently decided it wasn't worth panicking and had instead gone quiet and observational. She'd thought about that often in the weeks since, the strange calm of those 4 seconds, and wondered what it said about her that her mind went still at the exact moment most people's minds would shatter. She thought about Ryan Carter sitting on a cold concrete bench and saying, "I think you already think they've already decided." She had. She'd known, and she'd spent 2 weeks trying to argue herself out of the knowing. She picked up the phone and texted Dennis back. "I know. Thank you for trying. Don't do anything yet. I need to think." Then she put on her jacket, moved into her chair, and went down to the garden. It was late afternoon, nearly dark, and the garden was empty. She sat in the usual spot and looked at the dormant planters and the pale sky and the sparrow that was apparently living in the rafters above the garden door, because it was always here, always the same one. She sat there until the lights in the corridor shifted to the warmer evening setting and the temperature dropped another 5 degrees and she was genuinely cold. She was still sitting there when she heard the garden door open behind her. She assumed it was a nurse. She didn't turn around. "You're going to freeze out here," Ryan said. She turned around. He looked like he'd come from a shift, jacket over his uniform, the particular tiredness of someone who'd been moving fast for 8 hours and had just stopped. He had a paper cup of coffee in each hand, which she stared at for a moment. "I had a follow-up appointment with Sophie's allergist," he said, by way of explanation. "Second floor. I was heading out and I saw the light on in here." He held out one of the cups. "The cart's back. Coffee's still terrible." She took the cup. It was warm against her hands. "They named Dennis interim CEO today," she said. Ryan sat down on the bench. He didn't say anything right away. He turned the cup in his hands. "While I was in physical therapy," she added, "I found out from a news alert." "They didn't call you first?" "No." He exhaled slowly. "That's—" He stopped. "You can say it." "It's a cowardly way to do it," he said. "Yes." She looked at the coffee cup. "It is." They sat with that for a moment. The garden was very still. Somewhere above them the sparrow rustled once and went quiet. "I built that company," Elena said, not loudly, just stating it. "I know every client, every contract, every line of code in the core product. I know which investors need managing and which ones trust the numbers and which ones are just afraid of change. Dennis is good. He's genuinely good. But he's been there 5 years and I've been there since the beginning, and they still looked at me in this chair and thought—" She stopped. "Thought what?" Ryan said. "Thought that who I was before didn't count anymore." She said it flat, without the tremor she'd half expected. "Like the crash didn't just break my spine, like it reset everything." Ryan turned to look at her. "Does it?" "What? Does it reset everything, or does it just change what the path forward looks like?" She looked at him. In the fading afternoon light, with the cold coming in and the terrible coffee warm in her hands, she felt something she hadn't felt since before the accident. Not hope, exactly. Not yet, but something adjacent to it. Something that felt like the moment before a decision when the decision becomes inevitable. "You ask hard questions," she said. "You can handle hard questions," he said. She looked away. A beat of quiet. Then, "I need a different strategy. Something they won't see coming, because they've already written me off, and that's actually useful if I play it right." She was talking faster now, the legal pad version of her brain suddenly switching back on with a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. "They think I'm done, so I have time to move before they're watching." Ryan listened. He didn't follow all of it. The specifics of board dynamics were outside his world, but he understood the shape of what she was saying, someone who had been counted out deciding not to be. "What do you need?" he said. She glanced at him. The question seemed to catch her off guard. "I'm sorry?" Right now, practically. What do you need?" She thought about it, really thought about it. "I need my laptop," she said, "and Dennis on the phone tonight, and probably 8 hours of sleep that I am absolutely not going to get." She paused. "And someone to not treat me like I'm made of something breakable." "That one I can do," Ryan said. He said it without a flourish, without any weight on it, the way you offer something you actually have rather than something you want credit for offering. Elena looked at him for a long moment. The coffee in her hands had gone from warm to lukewarm. The garden lights had switched on automatically, casting the planters in a low yellow glow. "Why are you being kind to me?" she said. Not suspicious exactly, genuinely asking. Ryan thought about it. "Because you're not asking me to be," he said. "You're not asking for anything from anyone, and that means—" He paused. "I don't know. That means the scales are even. I'm not helping you because you need help. I'm talking to you because you're interesting to talk to." She was quiet for a moment. Then, for the first time in a very long time, Elena Whitmore laughed. It was short, a little rough around the edges, nothing like the practiced social laugh she'd used in boardrooms. It was the kind of laugh that comes out when something lands true. "Interesting," she said. "That's the word." "It's accurate," he said. She shook her head, looked back at the garden, and for a long while they simply sat there, in the cold and the quiet, Two people carrying things they hadn't expected to be carrying, and neither of them said anything more. And that was fine too. It was Sophie who changed it, but that came later, and in a way neither of them would have thought to predict. For now, in the failing light of a November afternoon, two people who had both lost their footing in the world sat in a hospital garden and breathed the same cold air and held their coffee cups and did not feel, for once, entirely alone. The call with Dennis lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Elena had her laptop open, 3 browser tabs running, and the legal pad propped against her knee with a pen she kept having to retrieve from where it rolled when she moved. Dennis was at his home office. She could hear his dog somewhere in the background, a retriever named Biscuit, who occasionally surfaced in company lore because Dennis had once accidentally included him in a video call with a Japanese client, and his voice had the careful, measured quality of a man choosing each word with the awareness that everything said tonight was going to matter later. "Walk me through the exact sequence," Elena said. "Not the version you'd tell the board. The version where you tell me what actually happened." Dennis was quiet for a moment. "Fletcher called a closed session 3 days ago. The vote to create the interim position was 4-2. Who were the two?" "Me and Patricia Eng." Elena wrote the names down. Patricia Eng was a newer board member, a former tech founder herself, someone Elena had advocated for when the board was expanding 2 years ago. She filed that away. "The press release language," she said. "Who wrote it?" "Fletcher's office. They didn't run it by legal until 30 minutes before it went out." "Which means they didn't want revisions." She tapped the pen against the pad. "Dennis, be honest with me. Is this about the chair, or is this about something else?" Another pause, longer this time. "I think," Dennis said carefully, "that the chair gave Fletcher the window he'd been waiting for. He's been uncomfortable with the pace of your decisions for about 18 months. The chair just gave him cover." She'd suspected that, had in fact suspected it for longer than 18 months, in the way you sometimes know a thing before you're willing to say you know it. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated, like he wasn't sure what that meant. "I'm not done," she said. "I want you to know that clearly. I am not done." "I know. But I need 60 days. Don't make any decisions about your own position yet. I know they're going to pressure you to make the interim arrangement permanent. Tell them you need time to assess operational continuity. Use that language specifically. It'll slow them down." "And in 60 days? In 60 days, I'll be back in that building." She said it without bravado, just as fact. "Make sure there's a ramp." She heard something shift in Dennis's voice. Not quite relief, but close to it. "There's already a ramp," he said. "I had facilities install it 2 weeks ago." She had not known that. She sat with it for a moment, the small thing he'd done without telling her, without any expectation that she'd find out or thank him for it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Thank me when you're back in your office." They hung up at 11:45. Elena sat in the dark room with the laptop screen the only light and the legal pad full of handwriting she could barely read, and felt something she was cautious about naming settle into her chest. Not confidence. She'd learned to be skeptical of confidence that arrived too easily. Something quieter. A sense of the path, which was different from certainty about where it led. She closed the laptop. She lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling. She thought about Ryan on the bench in the cold, asking what she needed. The directness of it. Most people who asked that question were performing concern. They expected a reassuring answer, something that let them feel useful without requiring anything real. Ryan had asked it like he actually wanted to know the answer and would try to help with whatever it was. She had not had many people like that. She'd had capable people, competent people, people who were excellent at their jobs and reliably showed up for the transactional parts of the relationship. She hadn't had many who just showed up, for no strategic reason, because they thought she was interesting to talk to. She fell asleep with the light on and the legal pad still open on the bed beside her, and for the first time in weeks, she slept the whole night through. Discharge came 10 days later, on a Tuesday morning in early December. The paperwork was extensive, and the process was slower than Elena would have designed it, but she'd learned by now that there were battles worth picking and battles that just cost you energy you needed for other things. She signed what needed signing. She listened to the discharge instructions from Dr. Osei, who was direct and clear in the way Elena had come to appreciate. No softening, No management, just information delivered with the understanding that the patient was an adult who could handle it. Outpatient therapy 3 times a week, Dr. Osei said. The home modifications we discussed. You've confirmed those are done? Contractor finished last Thursday. Good. And you have support at home? Elena thought about the apartment she'd returned to exactly once since the accident, a brief visit to retrieve items, during which she'd discovered that the layout she'd loved, the open-plan design, the polished concrete floors, the minimal furniture, was poorly suited to a wheelchair in ways she hadn't anticipated. She'd spent the following week on the phone with a contractor, and then with her assistant coordinating the modifications, and then with herself about what it meant to change the space that had been a specific kind of symbol to her. I have what I need, she said. Dr. Osei gave her the look that meant she wasn't entirely convinced, but respected Elena's right to define her own terms. You have my number, she said. Use it. Her assistant, a 28-year-old named Julia, who had been quietly, efficiently holding Elena's professional life together since the accident, was waiting in the lobby with a car. Julia had the particular brand of composure that comes from being highly capable and not needing acknowledgement for it. She'd sent Elena a daily briefing every morning throughout the hospital stay without being asked to, formatted exactly the way Elena liked, and had fielded questions from the board's office with a diplomatic firmness that Elena had noted and appreciated. There are 12 emails flagged urgent, Julia said as Elena transferred into the car. I've drafted responses to 8 of them. 4 need you directly. Send me the 4. Done. Fletcher Graves called this morning. He said he wanted to schedule a call at your convenience. Tell him Thursday, afternoon. She'd be ready by Thursday. Also, Julia paused in the way she did when something was slightly outside normal parameters. Orion Carter called the office line. He said he was a friend. He left a number. Elena looked out the car window at the hospital entrance as they pulled away. I have his number, she said. Julia made a small note. She did not ask any follow-up questions, which was one of her best qualities. The apartment was better than Elena had expected and harder than she'd anticipated, which she should have predicted because that was how most things worked. The contractor had done good work. The entry threshold was flush, the bathroom had been reconfigured, the kitchen counters on one side were lowered. The furniture had been rearranged based on the accessibility consultant's recommendations. It was functional, it was practical. It was also her home, and it looked different now, and she had to sit in the middle of it for a long moment on the first evening before she could begin to settle into the space again. She worked. That was how she dealt with most things, and the work was genuinely there to be done. She was on calls by 7 each morning, running her own research in parallel with what Dennis was sending her, building a picture of where the company stood and where it needed to go and how she was going to make the case, not to Fletcher, who had already decided, but to the shareholders who hadn't. She slept badly the first week. Not from pain, though there was that too, the particular insistence of a body relearning its own limits every day. She slept badly because the apartment was very quiet, in a way the hospital hadn't been, and quiet, she discovered, was its own kind of problem when your brain didn't know how to turn itself off. She called Ryan on a Wednesday night, later than she'd intended. She'd been in the middle of a financial model and looked up to find it was 9:47. He answered on the third ring, slightly out of breath. Hold on, he said, and then she heard a small voice in the background say, Dad, is it work? And Ryan say, 2 minutes, Soph, and then the sound of a door. Sorry, he said, bedtime negotiations. I called too late. It's fine. She pushes the boundary every night. She'd have found something else if it wasn't the phone. She could hear him settle into something, a chair maybe, or sitting on a bed. How's it going, being home? Strange, she said honestly. My apartment looks different. Different how? Practical, which is not how I designed it. She looked around the living room at the lowered coat hooks by the door, the rearranged furniture, the removal of the area rug she'd brought back from a trip to Portugal. It's the right kind of different. I know that. It just takes some getting used to. Yeah, he said. When I moved to a different apartment after my wife died, we'd been in the other place together for 4 years. The new one felt wrong for almost 6 months, even though I'd chosen it, even though it was better in every practical way. He paused. The wrong feeling goes away eventually, or you just get better at living alongside it. Which one happened for you? He thought about it. Both, I think, at different rates. She appreciated that he didn't flatten it into something cleaner than it was. How's Sophie? She asked. Good. She's been asking to go back to the hospital with the purple shoe nurse. He said it with the dry affection of someone accustomed to their child's non sequiturs. I told her the nurse probably works there every day, and Sophie seemed genuinely concerned about that. The idea that someone would be at work every day. Elena smiled. She's 6. That tracks. She also told her class that her dad has a friend who lives in a hospital, Ryan said. Her teacher sent a very gentle email asking if everything was okay at home. And you said? I said she meant a friend who'd been a patient. The teacher seemed relieved. He paused. You're Sophie's first. Friend of mine, I mean. She doesn't usually track them. Elena turned that over. She wasn't sure what category she occupied. She and Ryan had spoken fewer than a dozen times, in a hospital garden and a cold courtyard, over paper cups of bad coffee. She didn't know the name of his street. She didn't know his wife's name, or what kind of shifts he worked, or what he did on the days off. And yet she'd called him at 9:47 on a Wednesday because the apartment was quiet, and he was the person whose number was in her hand. I've been working on the board situation, she said, shifting to something less exposed. How's that going? Better than it was. I found something they missed, a contractual provision in the founding documents about the conditions under which an interim CEO arrangement can be made permanent. There are 3 conditions. They've currently met 1. She let that land. Which means I have more time than they think I do. That sounds like a person who's figured out the next move. I've figured out a next move, she said, which is different. There are a lot of variables I can't control. Like what? Like the fact that half the board believes the company's direction should shift, and that's a substantive disagreement that was always going to surface eventually. My injury just accelerated the timeline. She was quiet for a moment. Some of them aren't wrong, actually, about the strategic questions. I just think they're drawing the wrong conclusions. Can you convince them? Some of them, the ones who care about what's right for the company. She thought of Patricia Eng. The ones who are using this as an opportunity for something else, probably not. But I don't need all of them. I just need enough. She heard Sophie's voice through the door on Ryan's end, muffled, the specific pitch of a child who has waited exactly as long as they planned to wait. You should go, Elena said. Yeah. A pause. Elena. Yeah. The wrong feeling about the apartment. It does go away. She was quiet. I know, she said. And then, thanks for answering. Call whenever, he said. And the way he said it, not as pleasantry, not as obligation, just as the simple truth of what he meant, stayed with her after she hung up. In the apartment that looked different now, in the city that still felt slightly out of scale, in the life that was still in the process of becoming whatever it was going to be. 3 weeks later, Elena was in her first in-person board meeting since the accident. Dennis had arranged it. Technically, it was framed as an operational briefing. Elena joining remotely at first, then, when the call went longer than scheduled, and Fletcher suggested they reconvene in person the following week, Elena saying, I'll be there Thursday. Just like that. No qualifier. No, if that works for me, or I'll try. I'll be there Thursday. There was a brief silence on the line. That's, of course, Fletcher said. We'd be glad to have you. He sounded, Elena noted, like a man revising a set of assumptions in real time. The Whitmore Technologies offices were on the 14th floor of a building in the South Lake Union District. The lobby had a revolving door Elena had used every day for 4 years, and a set of elevators she'd ridden up 800 times, and a reception desk staffed by a young man named Greg, who had been there since her 2nd year, and who looked up when she came through the accessible entrance and said, entirely naturally, Morning, Ms. Whitmore. Do you want me to tell them you're on your way up? Please, she said. She rode up alone in the elevator, 14 floors. She'd always taken it fast, barely registering it, phone out, and already thinking about the first item on the agenda. Today she watched the numbers change and breathed in the particular smell of the building, climate-controlled air and carpet, and the faint trace of whatever cleaning product the overnight crew used, and let herself feel the weight of being back. It was not triumphant. It was not the moment in the movie where the music swells. It was just the elevator going up, and the smell of a place she'd built, and the steadiness in her chest that she'd been practicing for 6 weeks. The conference room on 14 had been standard when she'd designed it. A long table, chairs for 12, a wall of windows facing the water. Someone had added a small clear space at the head of the table. She didn't know if Dennis had arranged that or if Fletcher had, but either way she rolled to the head of the table and settled there and set her portfolio in front of her, and the room filled in around her over the next 10 minutes. Fletcher Graves came in last, which she suspected was intentional, the power move of the man who controls the room. He was 61, white-haired, the kind of patrician that American business produced in reliable quantities. He'd been on 3 boards before this one. He shook her hand warmly, with the practiced warmth of someone who had learned to perform it so consistently he might have forgotten it was a performance. "Elena," he said, "it's good to see you looking so well." "Fletcher," she said, "shall we get started?" The meeting was 2 hours. Elena presented for 40 minutes of it, a strategic review she'd built over the past 3 weeks that outlined the company's position, its vulnerabilities, its growth opportunities, and a forward roadmap that differed in several key respects from the direction Dennis had been pushed toward in her absence. She knew the numbers cold. She knew the client relationships. She knew where the product had drifted and what it would cost to correct it. She watched the room as she talked. Patricia Eng was engaged, leaning slightly forward, making her own notes. 2 of the others were with her. She could tell by the quality of their attention. 2 were unreadable. Fletcher listened with the careful neutrality of a man who had already decided but didn't want to show it too early. After she finished, there were questions. She answered them. When one of the board members, a man named Robert Ashby, who had been Fletcher's ally on the interim vote, suggested that the roadmap she was presenting was ambitious given the current transition, she let the word land on the table and looked at him directly. "I've been hearing that word a lot lately," she said. "I'd like to understand what specific element of this plan you consider ambitious, Robert. The projected revenue targets, the timeline, or the strategic pivot in the enterprise segment?" Ashby blinked. "The overall scope," he said, "given the circumstances." "What circumstances specifically?" He didn't answer. In the small silence, Patricia Eng said, "I think the enterprise pivot is the right call. The data supports it." She was looking at the document in front of her, not at Elena, but the timing of it was deliberate. The meeting ended without a formal vote on anything. Meetings like this one rarely did. But Elena drove home that afternoon with a precise read of where everyone stood, which was all she'd needed from it. She was in the apartment that evening, reheating something from the delivery she'd ordered 2 days ago and had been systematically eating, when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hi, this is Sophie. My dad doesn't know I have his phone. He's in the shower. I wanted to say I liked your chair when I saw it at the hospital. I have a cousin with a chair, and she's really cool too. Okay, bye." Elena read it twice. She sat with it for a long moment. Then she texted back, "Hi, Sophie. Your dad is lucky to have someone like you. Be careful with his phone." 3 dots appeared. Then, "I know. Okay, bye for real." Elena set the phone down. She looked at the apartment around her, the different-looking, practical, wrong-feeling apartment that she was slowly getting better at living inside. The lowered coat hooks, the rearranged furniture, the place where the Portuguese rug used to be. She picked up the phone and texted Ryan's number directly. "Your daughter texted me. She should probably not have your phone unsupervised." His reply came 4 minutes later. "Oh no, what did she say?" "That she likes my chair and her cousin is cool." A pause. Then, "I'm so sorry." "Don't be," Elena wrote back. "It was the nicest message I've gotten in months." Another pause, slightly longer. "She doesn't do that with many people," he wrote. "Say nice things out of nowhere to strangers." "I'm not a stranger anymore," Elena wrote. "Apparently." She sent it before she thought too hard about it. She watched the 3 dots appear and disappear and appear again, and then his reply came through. "No," he wrote. "I guess you're not." She put the phone down on the counter. The food was warm. The apartment was quiet, but a different kind of quiet than it had been the first week. Less like absence and more like space. She ate at the counter by the window, looking out at the city lights below, thinking about board meetings and contractual provisions, and a 6-year-old who texted strangers from her father's phone to say something kind. She thought about what it cost to keep going, in the specific way it cost when you'd lost the thing you'd organized everything around. She'd spent the week since the accident measuring the cost, cataloging it, almost, the way she'd catalog a company's liabilities. But sitting there in the light of the city she'd built something real inside of, she understood for the first time that there was a difference between knowing something costs you and deciding it's still worth the price. She hadn't been willing to decide that. Not yet. She'd been surviving forward on momentum and stubbornness, and the particular refusal to stop that had always been her most reliable quality. But sitting there, with the lights of the city below her and a text from a 6-year-old on her phone, she felt something shift in the specific place where the calculation lived. Not resolution, not clarity, just the beginning of being willing to decide. They met for coffee the following Saturday. Ryan's idea. He'd texted to say he owed her better coffee than the hospital cart had ever produced, and that there was a place 12 blocks from the rehab center that he'd passed 100 times and never gone into, and would she want to try it? She'd said yes before she finished reading the message. The cafe was small, 6 tables, worn wood, the smell of something being baked in a back kitchen. Sophie came with them. She was wearing rain boots with frogs on them and a jacket 2 sizes too large, and she walked in ahead of both adults with the complete confidence of someone who had claimed the territory already. "Dad, they have scones," Sophie announced. "I see that. Can I have a scone?" "If you eat half of it." Sophie appeared to consider this negotiation beneath her, but accepted it. She ordered with the serious deliberateness that small children bring to choosing food, confirming twice with the person behind the counter that the scone did not contain nuts, which Ryan watched with the alert quiet of a parent who had spent 3 years being very careful about allergens. They sat at the table by the window. Sophie ate her scone with surgical focus for approximately 4 minutes before losing interest and beginning to investigate the cafe's bookshelves, which held a disorganized collection of paperbacks and board games. "She saw a hedgehog book," Ryan said, watching her. "She seems like a hedgehog person." "She is extremely a hedgehog person. We almost got one last year. I said we'd discuss it when she turned 7. "And she's kept track?" "She has a countdown on her tablet." Elena smiled. She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug, real ceramic, good weight, actual decent coffee, and looked at him across the table. He looked different outside the hospital, less defined by context, more like just a person. "I went back to the office Thursday," she said. "Yeah? How was it?" "Hard, good." She thought about the elevator, the smell, Greg at the reception desk saying her name like she'd never left. "I think I'd forgotten what I was actually fighting for. I'd been so focused on the board, on Fletcher, on the vote, that I'd stopped thinking about the work itself. The company." She turned the mug. "Walking back in reminded me." "What did it feel like?" You've been favoring. There's pain in it, but also," she paused, "also the reminder that the leg is still there." Ryan looked at her. There was something careful and steady in the way he looked at her. Not cautious, not protective, just present. "Elena," he said. "Yeah." "I know we talk mostly because we keep running into each other," he said, "and because I was in the right elevator bank at the right time or whatever." He was turning his own mug now, not looking at it. "But I want you to know, it's not accidental anymore. For me." She looked at him. "I mean," he said, and then stopped. And the stopping was itself informative, because Ryan Carter did not typically struggle to find words. "I look forward to it, talking to you. I wanted you to know that." Sophie appeared at the table holding a copy of a board game with a pelican on the cover. "Dad, can we get this?" "We're not buying things at coffee shops, Soph. It's a game." "It's still a thing we're buying." Sophie weighed this. "What if I use my own money?" "How much money do you have?" "Some." Ryan looked at Elena. Elena looked back at him. "Some isn't a number," he said to Sophie. "It's between 4 and some more," Sophie said. Elena pressed her lips together to hold a laugh in. Ryan picked up his coffee cup with the expression of a man who had had this exact kind of conversation many times before and still had not developed immunity. "Bring it here," he said. "Let me see the price." Sophie immediately brought it over, sensing the negotiation had shifted in her favor. Elena watched them, Ryan turning the box over, Sophie watching his face for a read on the verdict. The particular unspoken communication between a parent and a child who had learned each other's rhythms over years of small moments like this one. She had spent her whole adult life in rooms full of people negotiating for things, contracts, territory, leverage. And she had never seen negotiation look like this, like something with no stakes and also everything. She thought about what Ryan had said, that it wasn't accidental anymore. She thought about the hospital garden and the elevator and bad coffee and paper cups. She thought about the text from a 6-year-old who thought her chair was cool. She thought about all the things she'd lost and all the things she was still fighting to get back, and the strange, unplanned, sideways way this man and this child had walked into the space between all of that. She thought, I didn't plan for this. And then, honestly, quietly, to herself, I'm not sure I mind. Ryan announced that the game was $6 and that yes, Sophie could buy it with her own money, which would leave her with somewhere between -2 and some. Sophie considered this math and declared it acceptable. She went to retrieve her wallet from Ryan's coat pocket. Ryan looked back at Elena. His expression asked nothing, committed to nothing. Just that steady, genuine look of a man who meant what he said and said it once. She looked back at him. I look forward to it too, she said, simply. No performance. Just the truth of it, set on the table between the coffee cups and the worn wood and the sound of Sophie asking the counterperson if she could get a bag for her new game. Outside the cafe window, Seattle moved in its ordinary Saturday way, people and rain and the smell of winter. And inside, something between two people that had been building without announcement became something they had both, finally, acknowledged out loud. The thing about saying something out loud is that you can't unsay it. Elena understood this professionally. She'd built a career on choosing words with the precision of someone who knew they landed permanently. But in the personal dimension, she'd spent most of her adult life keeping the important things inside the architecture of her own head, where they were safe and controlled and couldn't be used against her. Saying I look forward to it too across a coffee table to a man who had just made himself briefly, genuinely vulnerable was a small thing by most measures. It was 4 words. It changed nothing structurally about either of their lives. And yet she drove home from the cafe thinking about it in a way she didn't entirely want to examine. She had things to focus on. The board situation was not resolved. It was merely paused, the way a storm pauses, and she knew from experience that the quiet between pressure systems was not peace, but accumulation. Fletcher Graves had sent her a cordial email after the Thursday meeting, complimenting the presentation, noting that the board was looking forward to continuing the dialogue. She had translated this accurately as, "We are regrouping." She'd spent the following days building the shareholder case, reaching out quietly to 3 institutional investors who held significant stakes and who she'd maintained relationships with since the company's second round of funding. Not lobbying, not yet. Listening, reestablishing the connection so that when she needed it, it was there. Patricia Eng had texted her the evening after the meeting, just, "Good Thursday, keep going." Elena had saved it. So there was work. There was always work. And she was genuinely grateful for it. Not as avoidance, though she was honest enough to know it was partly that, but because the work was real, and she was good at it, and being good at something that mattered was its own kind of ballast. But she thought about Ryan, more than she'd have liked to admit to anyone, including herself. The problem, if it was a problem, which she wasn't ready to decide, was that Ryan Carter didn't fit any category she'd previously used for people who mattered to her. He wasn't a colleague, not a peer in the professional sense, not someone she'd found through the social networks that her life had always run through. He was a man she'd met by accident in a hospital corridor, who had crouched down to free a stuck wheel without asking permission, who had sat on a cold concrete bench and said things to her that landed true in the specific way that truth lands when you've been surrounded by careful, managed versions of it for too long. I was also a man with a daughter, and a grief that was 3 years old and still shaped the way he held himself, and a life that ran on a completely different set of coordinates than hers. And she wasn't sure, she was genuinely not sure, whether the pull she felt was about him specifically or about what he represented, which was a person who looked at her and saw her, which she'd been badly starved of. She was aware that these were 2 different things and that confusing them would be unkind to both of them. She was also aware that she might be overthinking it, which was her most consistent flaw and the one she was worst at correcting. She called her friend Diane on a Sunday afternoon. Diane Kowalski was 41, a journalist who'd known Elena since they'd lived in the same building during Elena's early startup years, and she had the invaluable quality of being willing to say exactly what she thought without requiring Elena to perform gratitude for it.
Okay, Diane said, after Elena had given her the relevant details. First, the board stuff. What's your actual timeline? 60 days was what I told Dennis. I think 45 is more realistic. Can you do it in 45? If the shareholder conversations go the way I think they will, yes. Possibly less. And the other thing, Elena was quiet. The EMT, Diane said. I didn't characterize him as a thing. No, you spent 9 minutes describing him and then stopped and I had to ask, which means you've already been in your head about it and you want me to name it so you don't have to. A beat. So, the EMT. He has a daughter, Elena said. I know, you said.
She's 6. She texted me from his phone. Diane was briefly quiet, then, that's kind of wonderful. It's kind of terrifying, Elena said. Also that. Diane paused. Elena, you know what I'm going to ask. You're going to ask what I'm afraid of. Yes. Elena looked out the apartment window. The city below was doing its weekend thing, indifferent to her. I'm afraid of needing something and being wrong about it, she said. I'm afraid of... I made bad decisions about Marcus. I thought that was real, and it wasn't. Or it was, but not in the way that counted, and I don't entirely trust my own reading of it. Marcus was a man who needed you to be one specific version of yourself, Diane said. He never asked questions. He never pushed back. He showed up when it was easy. A pause. Does this one do that? Elena thought about the garden, about being told you didn't ask me for comfort and meaning it as a compliment, about the way Ryan had said I think you already think they've already decided and not softened it. No, she said. Then it's a different thing, Diane said, simply. It might be too different, Elena said. His life and mine are both real and both complicated, and neither one eliminates the other, Diane said. Elena, you spent 6 weeks in a hospital learning you were still yourself. Don't talk yourself out of the first thing that actually proves it. Elena didn't say anything for a moment. Call me when the board stuff is sorted, Diane said. And Elena, call him too, yeah. January came in cold and gray and demanding, the way January does in Seattle, with a kind of atmospheric authority that made summer feel like something you'd imagined. Elena was at her desk by 6:30 most mornings, which wasn't different from how she'd always worked, except that the desk was now modified and the commute was from her bedroom, and she had a physiotherapy session 3 days a week that she'd stopped resenting and started treating as part of the workday. She and Ryan had fallen into a pattern that neither of them had formally named. They texted most evenings, usually brief, practical, sometimes funny, occasionally longer. They'd had coffee 3 more times at the cafe with the frog boot hedgehog enthusiast in tow, and once without Sophie because she was at Ryan's mother's for the weekend and he'd suggested dinner instead, which was a different word from coffee, and they both knew it. Dinner had been at a Thai place 6 blocks from Elena's apartment, chosen by Ryan because he'd done reconnaissance and confirmed it had no stairs and good space between the tables, which he mentioned so casually that she almost didn't catch it. He'd done it without asking her, without making it a point, without any of the labored consideration that most people turned into a performance of thoughtfulness. He'd just found a place that worked and suggested it. She'd caught it. She didn't say anything about it. She filed it in the place where she kept things that mattered. Over dinner, they'd talked for 3 hours without running out of things. About his work. He told her about the job in a way he clearly didn't often, the specific texture of it, the calls that went right and the ones that didn't, the way the job had changed for him after his wife died, when the urgency of saving strangers took on a different quality because he now understood in a more direct way what was on the other side. About her company, the strategy, what she actually loved about the work when she wasn't having to fight for her right to do it. About Sophie's hedgehog countdown and the board game with the pelican, which Ryan reported Sophie had played with exactly twice before declaring the rules confusing, which he suspected was accurate because he'd read them himself, and they were. He walked her to her car afterward. They stood outside for a moment in the January cold, the street mostly empty, a few restaurants still lit along the block. This was good, Ryan said. Yes, Elena said. I was looking at her with that particular direct quality he had, not intent in a pressing way, just present, like he was actually there, which was rarer than it should have been in her experience. She was aware of the distance between them, which was not very much distance. Ryan, she said,
Yeah, I'm not good at this part, she said. I want to be straightforward about that. I'm good at most things, but I've had a mixed record with the personal side. I make decisions fast in every other area of my life, and then I overthink this one. And I wanted you to know that in advance so that when I'm being strange about it, you have context. He looked at her for a moment. Then, I haven't done this in 3 years, he said. And the last time I did it, I was 26, and I had a completely different understanding of what mattered. So my record's not exactly polished either. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. That was all. But something had been established, without negotiation, without formal terms. An agreement that they were both carrying imperfect histories into this and were willing to do it anyway. He waited until her car pulled away before walking to his own. Bob. Fletcher made his move in mid-January, and he made it the way Elena had expected, through process rather than confrontation. He called a special board session, scheduled for the last Thursday of the month, citing the need for strategic alignment ahead of Q1. Dennis flagged it the moment he saw the calendar invite, texting Elena 3 minutes after it went out. This is it. He's going to push for a permanent transition vote. Elena had been ready for it for 2 weeks. She spent the days before the session in a state of focused, almost cold clarity that she recognized from the early years of the company. The pre-pitch headspace, the feeling of knowing she'd done every preparation possible and now it was just execution. She'd had 4 conversations with institutional shareholders, 3 of whom had expressed, in varying degrees of directness, that they had concerns about a leadership change they hadn't been formally consulted on. She'd documented the contractual provisions she'd found in December. She'd prepared a presentation that laid out, in plain financial terms, what the company looked like under her vision versus the direction Fletcher was implicitly pushing. She'd also had a call with a corporate attorney named Ewan, who'd been recommended by Patricia Eng and who had the quality Elena valued most in legal counsel. He told her what the situation actually was, rather than what she'd find most comfortable. The founding documents give you standing to contest a permanent appointment without shareholder ratification, he'd said. Whether the board respects that standing depends on how much noise you're willing to make. How much noise is effective without becoming destructive? She'd asked. Enough that the institutional investors apply pressure directly, not so much that the press angle becomes about instability. I can calibrate that. I believe you, Ewan said, in the tone of a man who'd done his research before the call. The session was in person. Elena arrived 8 minutes early, which was her practice. Not first, but not last. The room was the same conference room on 14, the same chairs, the same water-facing windows. Greg at reception had nodded at her like she'd been coming in every day, which was its own small kindness. Fletcher was already there when she entered, talking to Robert Ashby by the windows. They both turned. Fletcher's expression did the thing it had been doing since she came back. A brief recalibration, a fraction of a second where the expected picture of her didn't match the one arriving. Elena, Fletcher said, good to see you. Fletcher. She settled at the table. Robert. She opened her portfolio. Patricia Eng came in 2 minutes later, nodded at Elena, and took the seat 2 down from her. The other 3 board members arrived in the next few minutes, and the room settled into its pre-meeting arrangement. Fletcher opened by acknowledging the quarter's results, solid across the board, which Elena noted without expression because those results were the product of a strategy she'd built. Then he moved to what he called the question of leadership continuity, which was the phrase she'd been expecting. I think we all agree, Fletcher said, looking around the table with the practiced expansiveness of a man used to managing rooms, that stability is the priority as we head into the year. Dennis has done an outstanding job in a difficult transition period, and I think it's time we formalize that arrangement in a way that gives the company and our investors a clear picture of the road ahead. Silence for a beat. Elena said, I'd like to respond to that directly, if the room's open to it. Fletcher spread his hands. Of course. She didn't rush. She'd learned young that the impulse to fill silence quickly in contested situations usually hurt the person who felt it most. She let it sit for 1 more second. The founding governance documents for Whitmore Technologies specify 3 conditions for a permanent leadership transition initiated by the board, she said. A formal performance review process, a 60-day notice period communicated to the CEO in writing, and ratification by shareholders representing at least 30% of outstanding shares. She looked at Fletcher.
The board has met one of those conditions. I haven't received written notice, and no shareholder consultation has taken place. She set a copy of the relevant document section in front of her. I'm not asking for anything outside what was agreed to when this company was incorporated. The room was very still. Robert Ashby said, "The board has broad discretion in interpreting." "It does," Elena said, "within the scope of the founding documents. This is outside that scope." She looked at him with the specific calibrated directness she'd spent years developing. "Robert, I've spoken with several institutional shareholders over the past 3 weeks. They share my concern that a permanent transition conducted without their input sets a precedent that affects their own rights as stakeholders. I don't think any of us wants to spend Q1 managing a governance dispute instead of building the business." Another silence. Longer. Patricia Eng said, "I think Elena's position is procedurally sound." Fletcher's jaw moved in a way that meant he was recalibrating. He was not a man who got angry visibly. He was too practiced for that, but she could see the adjustment happening. "No one is suggesting we act outside our agreements," Fletcher said. "I know," Elena said, and kept her voice entirely level. "I'm simply making sure we're all operating from the same understanding of what those agreements are, which I think is better for everyone." The meeting ran another hour and 15 minutes. There was no permanent transition vote. Fletcher suggested a structured review process over the next 60 days, which Elena agreed to because she could afford to agree to it. 60 days was more time than she needed, and a structured review meant a defined process, which meant criteria, which meant standards he'd have to meet to remove her rather than simply deciding to. She drove home in the early February dark, feeling the particular quiet that comes after something high stakes has gone the way it needed to go. Not celebration. There was more work ahead, and she knew it, but the knowledge that she was still standing. She texted Ryan from the parking garage of her building, "Board session today." He blinked. His reply came 4 minutes later, which probably meant he was between tasks. "Good. You okay?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she wrote. "Actually, yes." "Come for dinner Saturday," he wrote. "Sophie wants to make pasta." Warning, her pasta is chaotic. Elena smiled at the phone in the parking garage, alone in the concrete quiet. "I'll be there," she wrote. She came on Saturday at 6. Ryan's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building in the east side, the kind of building that was solidly built and slightly worn at the edges in ways that meant people actually lived there. Scuff marks at the door threshold, a community bulletin board in the lobby with overlapping layers of flyers, an elevator that worked but took its time. Ryan had given her the building's access details, and she'd navigated up without issue. He opened the door before she knocked. "She's been talking about this since Wednesday," he said by way of greeting. "That's either flattering or concerning." "Both," he said. "Come in." The apartment was smaller than her place and felt more inhabited in a way she couldn't immediately name, more layered. Books stacked practically everywhere, a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator, shoes by the door in a configuration that told a story about two people's daily logistics. A shelf by the window held a few framed photos. She didn't look at them directly, but she was aware of them. Sophie appeared from the kitchen wearing an apron that was clearly designed for an adult and had been cinched up with what appeared to be a hair tie around her waist. She was holding a wooden spoon with the authority of someone who had been entrusted with significant responsibility. "You came," Sophie said. "I came," Elena said. "I'm making the pasta," Sophie said. "Dad's helping, but I'm making it." "I heard." Elena held out the small bag she'd brought. "I got this for after. I didn't know if you like chocolate." Sophie looked at the bag with the focused evaluation of a child who has strong feelings about dessert. "What kind?" "Dark chocolate with sea salt." Sophie considered. "That's a grown-up kind." "It is, but it's also good." Sophie considered further. "Okay," she said, and took the bag with great ceremony, carried it to the counter, and set it in a specific spot with the air of someone establishing territorial rights over it. Ryan, leaning in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel over his shoulder, looked at Elena with an expression she was still learning to read, something that was partly amusement and partly something warmer that he didn't put on display loudly. "Wine?" he said. "Please." The kitchen was small enough that 3 people in it was crowded, which meant Elena positioned herself at the end of the counter where she could see what was happening and stay out of the operational path. Sophie was rolling pasta dough with a commitment that involved her entire upper body. Ryan was managing the sauce on the stove and intermittently redirecting Sophie's technique in the patient, repetitive way of a parent who has learned that instructions need to be given several times before they become information. Not that side, Soph, you already rolled that side. I know, so roll the other side. I was going to. Okay. Elena watched them. She drank wine, which was good. Ryan had clearly put some thought into it. And she watched the two of them move around the small kitchen in the practiced, unconscious way of people who knew each other's rhythms completely, who had built their particular choreography through years of daily proximity. Sophie leaning back against Ryan's leg without looking at him while she concentrated on the dough. Ryan moving around her automatically, not thinking about where she was because he always knew where she was. It was the most domestic thing Elena had been inside in years. Her adult life had been built for other things. Efficiency, achievement, the particular loneliness of someone who worked very hard and called it fulfillment. She'd loved Marcus in the way you can love someone when neither of you is asking anything real of the other, and it had felt like enough until it turned out it wasn't. This was different. This was a man making pasta sauce in a small kitchen while his daughter rolled dough badly and confidently, and the dinner was going to be uneven, and the pasta was going to be various thicknesses, and none of it was curated or controlled. She found she wanted very badly to be inside it. After dinner, the pasta was, as promised, chaotic, and also genuinely good, and Sophie accepted the compliment on it with the gracious humility of someone who had been waiting for exactly that. Sophie was allowed 30 minutes of a show in her room before bed. She negotiated this 30 minutes up to 45 with a sequence of arguments that Ryan dismantled one by one until Sophie deployed the final position, which was simply standing in front of him looking at him until he adjusted. 40, Ryan said. 45, Sophie said. 40. Sophie considered the gap. 42. Ryan looked at the ceiling briefly. 42. Go. Sophie went. She paused in the hallway. Elena, she said. Yeah. The pasta was really good, right? Really good, Elena said. Sophie nodded with deep satisfaction and disappeared. Ryan sat down in the chair across from Elena and put his head back for exactly 3 seconds like a man briefly shutting down a system that had been running for many hours. Then he lifted it and looked at her. She negotiated you, Elena said. She always does. I know it's happening and I still can't stop it. He rubbed the back of his neck. She's going to be absolutely terrifying in about 20 years. She's already pretty effective. He smiled. The kitchen behind him was still showing the evidence of dinner. Pots, flour on the counter, the pasta shape Sophie had cut that were mostly irregular parallelograms. He hadn't cleaned it up yet, which Elena found she liked. The evidence of the meal still present. Can I ask you something? Elena said. Yeah. Your wife. She said it carefully. Do you talk about her? With Sophie. Ryan's expression did something. Not grief exactly, or not only that. More like the look of someone touching something that had changed shape over time but was still there. Yes, he said. We talk about her a lot. Sophie has a box. An actual box, like a shoebox, that she keeps things in. Photos, a few things that were her mom's. She takes it out sometimes and we go through it. He paused. It was a therapist's suggestion, actually. Good one. Does it help? Talking about it. I think it helps Sophie understand that missing someone and living your life aren't opposites, he said. She's young enough that she doesn't have a lot of calcified ideas about grief yet. She just feels it and also feels other things, and they coexist. He looked at Elena. Why? Because I don't want to be strange about it, Elena said directly. If this, whatever this is, continues, I don't want to navigate around it. I just want to understand it. Ryan was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with the expression she'd first noticed in the hospital garden. Not performing thoughtfulness, just actually thinking. You're not competing with anything, he said. I want you to know that. He said it plainly, without drama. What was what it was. This is its own thing. I know, she said. I just wanted to hear you say it. I know you did, he said. That's why I said it. She held his gaze for a moment. Outside the apartment window, the city was doing its night thing. indifferent, and ongoing. Somewhere down the hall, a small person was watching 42 minutes of something and probably negotiating that up to 45 by herself in her own head. Ryan got up and moved to the couch, which was a deliberate movement toward her rather than around her, and he sat close enough that the distance between them was no longer ambient. "Elena," he said. "Ryan," she said. He reached over and took her hand, not reaching for it, not a gesture. Just put his hand over hers, on the arm of her chair, where it was resting. His hand was warm and slightly rough and very steady. They sat like that for a while, not talking. Outside the window, Seattle in January. Behind the hallway door, a small person running out her 42 minutes. She turned her hand over and held his back. It was not a resolution. It was not the end of anything complicated. The board was still unresolved, and her apartment still felt wrong some mornings, and Ryan still had nights when the weight of everything he carried was visible in the set of his shoulders, even when he wasn't talking about it. None of that was gone. But she was sitting in a small apartment that felt more like a home than any space she'd occupied in years, holding the hand of a man who asked real questions and meant what he said, listening to the small sounds of a 6-year-old burning the last of her 42 minutes, and feeling not fixed, not restored, not the person she was before, but present. Entirely, genuinely present in her own life, which was, she understood now, what she'd actually lost in the crash. Not her legs, not the company, the ability to be inside her own life without managing it from a distance. She'd been finding her way back to that for months, in hospital gardens and bad coffee and board meetings, and a coffee shop with frog boots and sea salt chocolate. She hadn't known that was what she was doing until right now, sitting still in the quiet, feeling it arrive. Ryan didn't say anything. She didn't either. The city moved outside the window, and the night moved around them, and neither of them let go. The structured review process Fletcher had proposed lasted 41 days instead of 60, which was not because Fletcher moved it forward, but because Elena did. She'd spent those 41 days building a case so thorough and so grounded in specific numbers, specific relationships, and specific contractual realities that by the time she requested the special session in late February, she wasn't asking the board to believe in her. She was presenting them with the cost of not believing in her, laid out in plain language that institutional shareholders had already seen and responded to, and asking them to decide accordingly. Dennis had told her, the night before the session, that she had the votes. "How sure are you?" she'd asked. "Patricia's solid. Graves is going to fight it. The other 3? 2 are with you, one still reading the room." He paused. "You just need the 2. "I know," she said. She was at her desk, the city dark outside, a cold cup of coffee at her elbow, and the legal pad, the same one she'd started in the hospital, now almost entirely full, open in front of her. "Dennis, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that the way you handled the last 4 months, don't," he said. "Win first. Thank me after." She smiled. "Okay." She didn't sleep well, that was honest. She lay in the dark and ran through the meeting in her head the way she'd run through every major pitch in her career. Not rehearsing, exactly, but mapping. Finding the places where the argument had gaps and deciding in advance how to respond to them. She'd been doing this since she was 22 years old in a garage with a 3-person team and a product that wasn't ready yet, and investors she'd somehow convinced to believe in it anyway. The circumstances had changed. The essential activity was the same. She thought about Ryan. She thought about Sophie. She thought about a hospital garden in November, and a man who had crouched down to free a stuck wheel and then looked at her face instead of her chair. She thought about how much had happened in 5 months, and how strange it was that the worst period of her life had also been the period in which she'd most clearly understood what she actually needed. She fell asleep somewhere after 2 and woke at 5:30 with the specific alertness of a person who has processed something overnight without knowing it, and lay still for 10 minutes just breathing, and then she got up and went to work. The session started at 9. Elena arrived at 5 too, which was late for her. She'd spent the drive over dealing with a text from one of the institutional investors confirming their position, which she needed confirmation of before walking into the room. Greg at reception had a coffee waiting for her at the elevator, which she suspected Dennis had arranged and which she accepted without asking about its origin. The conference room on 14 was the same room it had always been.
Same chairs, same windows, same water view going gray-white under a February sky that couldn't decide between cloud and something thinner. Fletcher was there when she arrived, and for once he didn't try the power move of arriving last. He was already seated, which told her something about where his confidence actually was. Patricia Eng came in behind Elena and sat at her left. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The meeting opened with formalities. Then Fletcher spoke. He was measured, professional, the version of himself that had probably worked well in many rooms over many years. The patrician authority of a man who had learned to make his preferences sound like consensus. He made the case for a permanent leadership transition. He framed it around stability, around investor confidence, around the evolving needs of the organization in a competitive environment. He did not mention her disability directly. He didn't have to. It lived in the subtext of every third sentence, in the language of uncertainty and limitation and risk. And Elena listened to all of it and understood something she hadn't fully let herself see before. Fletcher Graves wasn't a villain. I was a man who had looked at her in a wheelchair and made a calculation that felt rational to him, that the disruption of the accident was a business risk, and that managing that risk meant managing her out. He'd convinced himself it was about strategy. Maybe he even believed it, but the calculation had been made the moment she lost the ability to walk, and everything since had been in service of a conclusion he'd reached before he'd seen a single piece of evidence. She understood this. She wasn't going to waste energy being angry about it. She was going to correct it. When Fletcher finished, Elena opened her portfolio. She spoke for 38 minutes. She laid out the company's performance under her leadership versus the trajectory projected under the interim arrangement. She laid out the shareholder communications, with their consent, showing that institutional investors representing 42% of outstanding shares had formally expressed preference for her reinstatement as CEO with full authority. She laid out the product roadmap she'd built and the client relationships she'd maintained, several of which Dennis had quietly confirmed had been contingent on her continued involvement. She laid out once, calmly and without drama, the governance violations that had occurred during her absence and the legal exposure they represented if left unaddressed. She said near the end, "I'm not asking this board to take a risk on me. I'm asking you to look at the evidence in front of you and make a decision consistent with what it shows. This company is what it is because of decisions I made over 8 years. The accident didn't change that record. The only question is whether this board can see that." Silence. Robert Ashby said, "Elena, no one here is questioning your record." "Then I'm not sure what we're deciding," Elena said. Another silence, shorter. Patricia Eng said, "I move that we table the proposal for permanent transition and instead confirm Elena Whitmore's reinstatement as CEO effective the 1st of March. One of the other board members, a woman named Carol Singh, who had been almost entirely quiet through both this meeting and the last, said, "Seconded." Fletcher said, "I'd like to discuss—" "We can discuss after the vote," Patricia said pleasantly. The vote was 4-2. Fletcher and Robert Ashby voted against. The other 4 voted for. Elena wrote nothing down. She sat at the head of the table and felt the number land, 4-2, and let it be what it was. Not a landslide, not a unanimous endorsement. A majority, which was what democracy actually looked like up close rather than in theory. Messy and partial and real. "Thank you," she said to the room. And then directly to Fletcher, because she was not a person who avoided the difficult moment. "Fletcher, I'd like to schedule a one-on-one this week. There are things about the company's direction I want your input on. Genuinely." Fletcher looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man who showed much, but she could see the small recalibration happening. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she agreed. "What?" She texted Ryan from the car, 4-2. His reply came back in under a minute, which meant he was not on a call and had his phone out. 4-2 good or 4-2 bad. "Good," she wrote. "I'm back." 3 dots. Then, "I know you are. Dinner tonight? Sophie wants to celebrate something and she doesn't know what yet." Elena laughed in the car, alone, genuinely, the kind of laugh that has relief in it. "Tell her we'll figure out what we're celebrating when I get there," she wrote. "She'll accept that," he wrote back. "She's flexible on reasons, firm on the celebration itself." March came in a different city, or the same city seen differently, which amounts to the same thing.
Elena's first week back as active CEO was exactly as hard as she'd expected, and in different ways than she'd prepared for. The board vote had resolved the formal question, but not the atmospheric one. Fletcher's coalition was still present, still watchful, and 3 members of the senior leadership team had spent 4 months operating under Dennis's interim direction and needed time to recalibrate. Not because any of them were disloyal, but because organizations develop gravity in whatever direction they're pointed, and redirecting that took sustained pressure, not one meeting. She came in every day, not to prove something. She'd stopped needing to prove things to the people who were already decided against her and started focusing on the people who were watching to see what she'd actually do. She made decisions. She communicated them clearly. She had the honest conversation with Dennis about his role going forward, which was harder than the board meeting had been because Dennis was someone she respected, and she needed him to know that she wasn't sidelining him. She was restoring a structure that worked. And those are different things, but they can feel the same from the inside. Dennis took it well. He always did. He said, "I was keeping the seat warm. I'm glad the seat's occupied again." She said, "The ramp you had installed, I want you to know that mattered." He waved it off in the way people wave things off when they matter. "Don't make it a thing." "Too late," she said. "It's a thing." He smiled. They went back to work. The harder part was the day-to-day reality of running a large company from a wheelchair in a world that was still, despite best intentions, designed around assumptions she no longer fit. The building was accessible but not seamlessly so. There were small frictions daily that accumulated in ways she hadn't anticipated. A conference room that technically complied with standards but positioned her awkwardly relative to the table. A client presentation space where the setup required her to ask for adjustments she'd have previously made herself without thought. Colleagues who had recalibrated their behavior beautifully, and colleagues who were still in the process, and colleagues, fewer but present, who had not yet managed it. She dealt with each of these without making them the point of her day, because the moment she let the friction become the story, she'd lose the narrative she was actually trying to tell, which was not about disability or recovery or resilience in the inspirational poster sense. It was about a person who built something real and came back to it and continued building. That was the story. The rest was context. She also, quietly and without announcement, initiated a company-wide accessibility review. Not as a PR effort, not with a press release, but as an operational decision with a budget and a timeline and a person accountable for it. She told the team lead, "I want to know everywhere in this building and our systems where the design assumes something about the user that isn't always true. Then I want to fix it." That was all. It took her until April to feel like herself in the building again. Not the self she'd been before. That person was gone. Or not gone, but changed in ways that couldn't be reversed, and she'd stopped wanting to reverse. A different self. Someone who had been through something and come out the other side with a more accurate map. She and Ryan didn't rush anything, and didn't not rush it either. Things developed in the way things develop between two people who are both too busy and too honest for games. Unevenly, with occasional friction, with the normal accumulation of small misunderstandings that require actual conversation to resolve. There was one evening in March when it got hard. They'd had dinner at his place, the 3 of them, and Sophie had a bad night. She'd been tired and overstimulated and had a crying meltdown over something small that was clearly not actually about the small thing. And Ryan had handled it with the patient consistency of someone who had done this many times. And Elena had stayed out of it because she understood it wasn't her place to step in. And when Sophie was finally down and Ryan came back to the kitchen, he was visibly depleted in the way parents get depleted. Not dramatically, just emptied. And Elena had said something. She couldn't even remember exactly what she'd said. Something about a strategy she'd have tried, something she'd read, said with the good intention of being useful. And Ryan had looked at her with a quiet flatness that was worse than argument and said, "I know you mean well, but I've been her parent for 6 years. I know how to handle it." The room had gone still. He was right. She'd overstepped. She had no framework for what she'd stepped into. She'd said, "You're right. I'm sorry. I was trying to help and I got that wrong." He'd exhaled, rubbed his face. "I know," he said. "I'm just tired." "I know," she said. They'd sat with it for a few minutes, the honest discomfort of 2 people who weren't going to pretend the moment hadn't happened. Then he'd said, "It's not, I want you here. I just need you to follow my lead with her. Until there's more time and she's more, he paused. Until things are more established. Okay, she said, tell me what that looks like and I'll do it. It looks like what you were doing before you gave me the parenting tip, he said, and there was something in it that was almost humor, still slightly raw. Got it, she said. They didn't break anything that night. They repaired it instead, which is harder and more important, and told her more about what this was than any of the easier evenings had. She drove home thinking, this is what it actually costs. Not grand gestures, not the big moments, the small ones, the corrections, the willingness to be wrong and stay in it anyway. She could pay that price. She wanted to. Sophie's 7th birthday fell on a Saturday in April. Ryan had planned a small party, 5 kids from her class, a cake with a hedgehog on it, because Sophie had spent the better part of 6 months making clear that this was the only acceptable theme, and a backyard at Ryan's mother Margaret's house where there was more room than the apartment, and a small garden that Sophie had declared an appropriate venue. Elena had been invited, not as Ryan's girlfriend, not with any formal label attached, just as someone Sophie wanted there, which Sophie had communicated to Ryan by saying, "Is Elena coming to my birthday?" in the tone of someone for whom this was already settled, and Ryan was simply being briefed. Elena had brought the hedgehog book. The real one, a proper illustrated guide to hedgehogs, with good photographs and actual information, which she'd researched with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, and which had arrived in the mail with a card that she'd spent longer than she'd admit writing. Margaret Carter was 63, warm in the specific no-nonsense way of a woman who had raised a son through grief and helped raise a granddaughter, and was still standing, which was its own curriculum. She met Elena at the back gate, took one look at her and said, "You're the one from the hospital." "I am," Elena said. "Sophie talks about your chair," Margaret said. "She thinks it's cool."
She told me, Elena said. She also told her class you're a princess, Margaret said. I'm not sure where she got that. Neither am I. Margaret smiled, briefly, assessing, the smile of a woman deciding what she thought. "Come in," she said. "Ryan's dealing with a piñata situation." She went in. The afternoon was chaotic in the way children's parties are chaotic, loud and joyful and operating on a logic entirely its own. 5 7-year-olds in various states of sugar-fueled momentum. A piñata that turned out to be structurally over-engineered and required Ryan to intervention with a broom handle, while Sophie supervised with great authority. A cake that listed slightly, but tasted, Sophie announced, like a perfect cake. Music that nobody was really listening to, but that gave the whole thing a pulse. Elena sat in the garden and watched it. She wasn't on the outside of it. Several of Sophie's friends had approached her with the complete lack of ceremony children bring to new people, asking direct questions about the wheelchair with a matter-of-factness she found refreshing. One child asked if she could go fast in it. Elena demonstrated. The child declared this extremely cool and ran to tell the others. Ryan caught her eye from across the garden and gave her a look that said several things at once, efficiently. She looked back. At some point in the afternoon, when the party had reached that slightly post-peak phase, where energy starts becoming fatigue and the pile of opened presents is overwhelming, and Sophie was sitting in Margaret's lap having reached the natural end of a 7-year-old's hosting stamina, Ryan sat down next to Elena in the garden. "She loves the book," he said. "She's been carrying it around for 2 hours. She told me she's going to read the whole thing before bed." He paused. "She reads approximately 4 pages before she falls asleep, so that's an optimistic projection." "She's 7, Elena said. "Optimism is appropriate." I was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden, at Sophie in her grandmother's arms with the book held against her chest. The afternoon light was doing the early spring thing where it goes golden earlier than you expect and makes everything look slightly more significant than it is. "I've been thinking about something," Ryan said. Elena waited. "I've been thinking about what this is," he said. "Between us. And I know we've been taking our time with it, which I think was right. But I don't want to be in a position where the taking our time becomes its own kind of avoidance." He turned to look at her. "I don't want to be careful with you. I want to be honest with you, which is different." "I know the difference," she said. "I know you do." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I'm in this," he said. "I want you to know that clearly, not as a thing that might develop into something or a direction we're heading. I'm already in it. Sophie is already in it, which she gets a say in that. She's my kid, but she's made her position pretty clear." He met Elena's eyes.
I wanted to say it out loud so it's not just something we're both assuming. She looked at him. Ryan Carter, who had crouched down in a hospital corridor to help a stranger, and then looked at her face, who had sat on cold concrete benches and told her true things, who had held her hand in a small apartment while his daughter ran out 42 minutes and the city went on outside. Who was imperfect, impatient sometimes, tired often, who carried his grief like a thing he'd learned to live with rather than a thing he'd resolved, who had told her she'd overstepped with Sophie and been right. "I know you're in it," she said. "I've known for a while." She held his gaze. "I'm in it too, completely." He nodded, not with relief. He'd been fairly sure she could tell, but with the particular quality of a thing being confirmed that you needed confirmed, because some things need saying out loud even when you already know. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. Margaret appeared at the back door and said, "Are you two going to sit in the garden all evening, or are you coming in for leftover cake?" Ryan stood. "Coming." He looked down at Elena. "You want to go in?" "Yeah," she said. "I want to go in." The company's Q1 earnings came out in the second week of April. 41% year-over-year revenue growth. 3 new enterprise contracts signed since March, all of which Elena had been directly involved in closing. The board meeting at which the results were presented was the first one in months where Fletcher Graves didn't look like a man preparing to contest something. He didn't exactly look happy. She wasn't expecting happy, and she wasn't chasing it. But he looked at the numbers with the expression of a person updating a calculation, and at the end of the meeting he shook her hand and said, "Strong quarter," and she said, "Yes." And that was the most honest exchange they'd had since before the accident. She had the one-on-one with him that she'd promised. It was uncomfortable for most of its length, which was appropriate. He was stiff about some things, and surprisingly candid about others, and she left with a more complete picture of his concerns, some of which were wrong, some of which were right, and several of which she incorporated into the company's Q2 strategy without crediting him for them directly, though she told Dennis afterward and Dennis said, "Good, use everything that's useful. Doesn't matter where it came from." She thought about that often. Use everything that's useful. The accident, the hospital, the garden, the bad coffee, the legal pad filled cover to cover, the board meetings, the conversations in cold air. All of it had been data. All of it had shaped the person now sitting in her office making decisions about a company she'd built and was still building. She thought about who she'd been before the accident, driven, capable, controlled, lonely in ways she hadn't acknowledged to herself. She'd organized her life for achievement and confused achievement with fullness, and it had taken everything being taken away for her to see the difference. She didn't think the accident was necessary for that understanding. She didn't believe in necessary suffering, but she'd been through it, and she'd learned what she'd learned, and she wasn't going to perform gratitude for the hard parts. She was just going to keep going, knowing what she now knew. She told this to no one directly. She didn't post it or speech it or put it into a press interview when a journalist from a business publication asked her, in May, whether the accident had given her a new perspective. She said, "I have a different relationship to time now, and I'm a better listener than I used to be." That was true, and it was enough. Summer arrived early and warm, the way Seattle summers do when they decide to show up. Not gradually, but all at once, as if the city woke up one morning and remembered what it was supposed to feel like. Sophie's hedgehog arrived on a Tuesday. Ryan had relented at some point in June, citing good behavior, the completed 7th year, and the fact that Sophie had by then read the hedgehog book 4 full times, which he considered evidence of genuine commitment. The hedgehog was small and prickly and regarded everyone with deep suspicion, which Sophie found completely charming. She named him Ptolemy, which Ryan attributed to a documentary about space she'd watched twice in the spring and which she seemed to feel applied. Elena met Ptolemy on a Saturday. He regarded her with the specific contempt that small animals reserve for people they don't know, which Sophie felt was actually a sign of respect. "He doesn't show respect to everyone," Sophie said seriously. "I feel honored," Elena said. "You should," Sophie said. Ryan, from the kitchen. "Sophie, let Elena sit down before you give her the full Ptolemy briefing." "I'm giving her context," Sophie said. "The context can wait until she has coffee." Sophie considered this. "Fine," she said, and led Elena to the couch with the air of someone who was accommodating an unreasonable but manageable request. The apartment had changed since November. Not the layout. It was still the same small place with the books and the scuff marks and the bulletin board in the lobby downstairs. But it had more of Elena's presence in it now, the way spaces do when people have genuinely been there enough times. A book she'd left and forgotten. A mug she'd used 4 times and Ryan had stopped putting away because it had found a specific place. A drawing Sophie had done of the 3 of us, executed with the abstract expressionism of childhood, but recognizable in the way that mattered. 3 figures, one with wheels that Sophie had drawn as circles because she understood them to be the relevant feature, all standing in a garden she'd colored aggressively green. The drawing was on the refrigerator. Elena had looked at it for a long time the first time she'd seen it. Ryan had noticed. He hadn't said anything, which was the right call. Some things were better received in silence. She had a life. It was not the life she'd planned, not the one she'd had, not the version she would have designed if someone had asked her in advance what she wanted. It had parts in it that hurt, and parts that were still uncertain, and parts that required daily maintenance in the same way anything real does. Her body was what it was. She'd stopped expecting it to become something different and started treating it as the body she had, with its limits and its capabilities both. The therapy continued because it was useful, not because she was waiting to arrive somewhere. She had a company she'd built and was still building. She had a board she'd navigated back into alignment with. Mostly, Fletcher would never be her champion, but he'd become someone she could work with, which was sufficient. She had Dennis and Patricia Eng, and Julia, who sent her the daily briefing formatted exactly right, and Greg at reception, who had a coffee waiting at the elevator. She had Diane, who called on the first Sunday of every month with no agenda except to be Diane, which was a specific and irreplaceable thing. She had Ryan, who was difficult to summarize in a word or a category because he didn't fit neatly into any of the ones she'd previously used. He was not her project, not her savior, not the soft landing she hadn't known she needed. All of those framings flattened something that was actually more complicated and more honest. He was a person who had looked at her and seen her, in a hospital corridor, before he had any reason to, and had kept looking ever since. She had done the same for him. That was the full extent of the explanation. Sometimes the most important things didn't require more architecture than that. She had Sophie, who was 7 3/4 and counting, who had named her hedgehog after an astronomer, and who texted from other people's phones, and who had walked up to Elena's wheelchair in a hospital garden in November with a small yellow flower that she offered without explanation and without expectation. That moment had not been magic. It had not been a turning point in the cinematic sense. It was a child being kind with no strategic purpose, which is either the simplest thing in the world or the most complicated, depending on how much you've been without it. Elena had thought about it many times. She thought about it now, sitting in the apartment on a summer Saturday with Ptolemy the hedgehog eyeing her from Sophie's lap and coffee on the table, and Ryan somewhere in the kitchen doing something that involved more cabinet opening than seemed necessary, and the sun coming through the window at the specific angle that made the worn parts of things look warm instead of worn. She thought about who she'd been before the crash. The person who moved fast and controlled rooms and had organized her life so efficiently that there was no room in it for anything that didn't serve a function. She understood that person. She didn't miss her exactly, but she didn't resent her either. That person had built real things, had worked with a specific and genuine intensity that still lived in her and still drove her, and had helped her fight her way back into her own company when the easier thing would have been to let go. The crash had not made her better. Loss doesn't work that way, despite what people sometimes want to believe. That suffering has a yield, that pain produces wisdom in a reliable ratio. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it just costs you, and the cost is all it is. But she'd been through it, and she'd found, on the other side of it, a version of herself that was less armored and more honest, and this was the part she was still getting used to, more willing to need things. To admit the need without immediately converting it into a plan. She needed Ryan. She needed Sophie's unselfconscious acceptance of her, which was a gift she'd never asked for and couldn't have manufactured. She needed Diane calling on the first Sunday. She needed Dennis saying use everything that's useful. She needed the sparrow in the hospital garden that had been there every morning without explanation or purpose. She needed her work, which was real and mattered, and was hers. And she needed the specific, unglamorous daily act of getting up and going back to all of it. Back to the building, back to the apartment with the frog boots in the hallway, back to the life that had been remade around her whether she'd chosen it or not. The choice was never whether to have the life you'd planned. The choice was whether to fully enter the one that was actually there. Ryan came out of the kitchen with 2 coffees. He set one in front of her. He sat down. Sophie was describing Ptolemy's dietary preferences in scientific detail. He looked at Elena over Sophie's head. Just looked. The steady, genuine look of a man who was completely present in his own life and had somehow, improbably, unexpectedly, in the corridor of a hospital where he'd been waiting for an elevator, made room in it for her. She looked back. Outside, the summer morning moved through Seattle in its unhurried way, and the coffee was warm, and Ptolemy the hedgehog accepted a small piece of strawberry from Sophie's hand with great reluctance and then ate it immediately. And somewhere in the city a company was running with her name on it, and her strategy driving it, and her people inside it doing the work. And none of this was what she'd planned, and all of it was hers. She picked up the coffee. She stayed.